Moving on now, though, and a new report by the Henry Jackson Society has revealed that 40% of young university-educated Muslims do not believe that Hamas definitely committed murder and rape during the October the 7th attacks on Israel. The survey also found that 40% of all Muslims living in the UK sympathise with Hamas.
Well, joining us to discuss this is the founder of the Henry Jackson Society, who commissioned that report, Dr. Alan Mendoza, and Dr. Rakib Ehsan, an expert in British attitudes. Right, I'm going to start with you, Alan. Looking at the big headlines that have been produced in this report, I think there is sort of pause for some degree of concern that there seems to be some sort of attitudes within minority communities in this country that aren't particularly in harmony with what we would want to suggest were overarching British values. But was it a completely sort of negative report, or are there some positives to gain from it as well?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, unfortunately, it is the poll itself is not a great poll in terms of the findings that have come out of it. I think the important thing to note is that across the board, there appear to be some problems of extremism, which will need to be looked at and ironed out quite urgently, I think, given the degree to which some things are held. And it's worth bearing in mind the poll had three constituent parts, if you like. There was, if you like, a foreign policy section on Israel, which, frankly, you probably expect a degree of divergence from the general population, which was a control poll. You then had an anti-Semitism one where you might have expected it, but not, thought it was right that there was a divergence there because it's, wrong to obviously be racist. And finally, there was a sort of what's going on in the UK policy where I think the results were also quite worrying in terms of how this worked. So I think across the board, there are potential problems. I think the interesting part about where there is a positivity is if you look at the general poll, all general people who are responding think there is a big problem with extremism in this country. So I think that is important to note, that people are aware that there's a problem there. And also, very interestingly, when asked to determine which of the three forms of extremism, whether it is radical Islam or it is far right or far left, is the most pressing, most people go for radical Islam, which I think is an interesting one, because we've been fed quite a lot over the last years telling us that this is not the biggest problem, that the far right is the biggest rising problem in this country, but people do not seem to buy that. And the last point is, most interesting about that was that even among BAME respondents, so the people who could legitimately be expected to fear the far right more, say, than others, they too picked radical Islam as the biggest threat as far as they're concerned on the extremism three. So there are some interesting results among those.
Alan, I want to come back to you, and I thought that some of the results on things such as whether Sharia law should exist in this country are quite interesting. I don't have the figure in front of me, so you can remind me of what it was, but I remember it being a relatively high percentage in terms of being in the double figures. Does this suggest that what's happening as a result of increased inward migration is a sort of atomization of society, where maybe those first sort of Windrush migrants who came over and settled here didn't hold on to those sort of cultural values and did integrate, but somehow we're now building up layers where we're importing belief systems, not belief systems so much, but cultural mores that are in direct friction with our own?
Well, I think what's quite clear when you look at results like that, and on that particular one, there was a 1 in 3 who expressed either moderate or strong support for Sharia law. I think what you're seeing is a failure of integration policy. I'm not sure it's necessarily tied per se to waves of migration, because actually what's interesting is that UK-born Muslims throughout the study appear to be slightly more radical than foreign-born Muslims, which tells you that there's a bigger problem going on within the UK right now about how we're integrating and how we're bringing people to share values with each other. And this is not new. We've been, lots of us have been looking at this for, decades now, going and saying that the government has not, or governments, I should say, have not placed enough of a premium on this issue. They haven't built up civic values. They haven't built up participation. And unfortunately, you're going to reap the sort of whirlwind from that down the line if it keeps on going like this. And polls like this will become more common rather than less common if we do not get integration policy into sharp order.